Imagine serving fresh food in the middle of summer using ice cut from a frozen lake 6 months earlier. Entire cities depended on that system throughout the 1800s, and it worked reliably at industrial scale. What made it possible wasn't just cold weather. It was a chain of specialized machines, horse-powered conveyors, long ice saws, harvesting rail systems, and insulated ice houses built to hold winter's cold through the height of summer. This video traces how that entire system worked, from frozen lakes to the ice houses that kept food cold through the summer. Persian ice storage. Picture a Persian city in the middle of summer. The air outside is sitting at 100 degrees, and yet somewhere inside the royal court, ice is being served. Not symbolically, actual ice in a cup in the desert heat. That was not a luxury reserved for one exceptional season. It was routine, and it was engineered. The structure that made it possible was called a yakchal. These were not simple cold pits dug into the ground. They were large domed vaults, some of them rising 15 meters above the surface, with walls at the base nearly 2 meters thick. The underground portion extended deep enough that the earth itself became part of the insulation system. The engineering problem was straightforward to state and difficult to solve. Heat moves toward cold, always without stopping. So the question was never how to create cold. It was how to slow the rate at which warmth invaded the stored ice. The Persians solved that through 3 principles working together. First, the dome shape. A dome exposes less surface area to direct sunlight than a flat or rectangular structure of the same volume, so less heat was conducted through the walls to begin with. Second, the walls themselves were built from a composite mud brick mixture. Sand, clay, egg whites, and ash combined into a material that absorbed heat slowly rather than passing it straight through. Third, and most mechanically interesting, the yakchal used wind catchers called badgirs. These were vertical shafts that caught prevailing winds and directed cooler night air down into the vault, while warmer air escaped through vents near the top of the dome. The structure was continuously ventilated in a controlled direction. Ice was brought in from mountain streams during winter, packed in layers, and separated with straw between blocks. The straw slowed the transfer of warmth from one block to the next. The underground chamber stayed close to freezing temperature while the desert above it baked through summer. What's worth noting is that none of these principles were unique to Persia. Every one of them, insulation layering, controlled airflow, underground thermal mass, showed up again independently in the ice houses that New England operators were building in the 1800s. Not because anyone studied the yakchal and copied it, because the physics hadn't changed. The same problem produces the same answers, separated by 2,000 years and half a world of distance. A single yakchal served a district, not a continent. The scale was limited to what mud, straw, and manual labor could achieve. But the variables it identified were exactly the variables that later industrial ice systems would address with larger machinery and greater precision. The engineering gap between a Persian mud dome and a 19th century New England ice house is narrower than it looks. What changed was the scale of the tools, not the logic behind them. Ice harvesting begins. In January, on a frozen Massachusetts lake, a crew would drive a horse out across the ice and watch where the hooves cracked the surface. That told them where the ice was too thin to work and where it was safe to cut. The harvest hadn't started yet. That was just the first step. By the mid-1800s, the long ice saw had become the primary cutting instrument on lakes across New England. The blade ran up to 6 feet in length, mounted on a weighted frame so it tracked straight and cut deep. But the blade itself was only part of what made the system work. The geometry of the cut mattered just as much as the sharpness of the edge. Irregular blocks left air gaps when stacked inside an ice house, and air gaps meant faster melting. So the industry settled on a standard block size, roughly 22 inches by 44 inches. Those dimensions weren't chosen at random. They packed tightly together, moved efficiently on conveyors, and fit the interior dimensions of the ice boxes that would eventually receive them at the end of the supply chain. Ice cutting system. The cutting sequence followed a strict order. The long ice saw made the first pass, scoring a shallow channel across the lake surface. That channel acted as a guide groove for everything that followed. A horse-drawn ice plow, a blade fixed to a weighted frame, pulled by a single draft horse. Then deepened that channel in repeated passes until it reached nearly the full thickness of the ice. Workers with hand chisels and braking bars finished the job, separating scored sections into individual blocks along the pre-cut lines. Once a block was freed from the sheet, it didn't need to be dragged. It floated. The water filling the open channel carried each block to the loading point at the lake's edge, and the lake itself became part of the transport system. That detail mattered because a fully cut block weighed several hundred pounds. At the loading point, horse-powered conveyors took over. These were inclined ramps fitted with iron-toothed chains or cleated belts, driven by a horse walking a circular path on the bank. The mechanism gripped each block as it came out of the water and carried it up the ramp directly into the ice house. A well-coordinated crew working this system could move hundreds of tons in a single day. Narrow-gauge harvesting rail systems extended the process further, running tracks from the lake's edge to the ice house doors, so loaded sleds could be pulled into stacking position by horse or gravity. Every stage of the system was designed around the same principle: keep the block moving without requiring a man to lift its full weight. Score, float, convey, stack. The 22 by 44-inch block was the fixed unit around which every conveyor width, every wagon bed, and every icebox compartment had been built. If you enjoy learning how everyday life worked before modern technology, the systems, tools, and machines people relied on, consider subscribing. This channel explores the forgotten engineering that kept cities running. Ice house storage. Once the blocks came off the conveyor and into the ice house, the work wasn't done. It was just starting. The entire purpose of the ice house was simple: keep winter ice frozen long enough to preserve food through the heat of summer. Every decision made inside that building, from the floor up, was either slowing the melt or speeding it along. The men who packed these structures understood that in practical terms, because a poorly managed ice house showed it directly in lost stock. The floor came first. Before any ice was laid down, workers spread a thick bed of sawdust or straw across the entire floor, sometimes a full foot deep. The ground beneath, even in January, conducted enough warmth to begin working on the bottom layer of any block sitting directly against it. That bed of sawdust broke the contact and slowed the transfer. Blocks were then stacked in tight, interlocking courses, the same way dry stone walls are built. Each block bearing against the ones beside it, no gaps, no loose edges. That mattered because a block surrounded by other blocks on all sides loses heat far more slowly than a block with open air around it. The mass of ice became its own insulation. Between each course and around the outer walls, workers packed sawdust or straw into every gap they could reach. Those materials weren't cold. They worked because their fibrous, air-filled structure was a poor conductor of heat, so warmth moving inward from the outer wall slowed down before it could reach the ice at the center of the stack. The buildings themselves were double-walled, with the cavity between inner and outer wall packed with more insulating material. Roofs were steeply pitched to shed heat quickly and fitted with ventilation gaps at the ridge. So warm air, which rises, could escape rather than collect against the ceiling directly above the ice. Drainage ran underneath all of it. Meltwater had to move away from the ice continuously, because water sitting against a block conducts warmth back into it. Ice houses were built on a slight grade, or fitted with channels cut into the floor so that water drained away the moment it formed. Many ice houses in the Northeast were partially buried, with the lower portion of the structure set into the earth. Deep ground holds a near constant temperature well below the summer heat at the surface, so the buried walls were working with the same thermal mass principle the Persian yakhchal had relied on, just executed in timber and brick instead of mud. By late summer, delivery crews pulled from the bottom of the stack, the oldest ice, most compressed, densest, and the last to give way to heat, while the upper layers had already moved out through the season. The best-run operations held melt losses to around 10% across a full summer. Poorly managed ones lost 30%. That gap came down entirely to how carefully the packing sequence had been followed from the first day of the harvest. Delivery and ice boxes. The Iceman arrived before dawn. He drove a wagon fitted with insulated compartments and a heavy canvas cover, and he carried a handpick to split blocks to the size each customer needed, right there at the curb. Butcher shops, fish merchants, hotels, hospitals, private homes. He served all of them on the same route, every 2 to 3 days through the summer months, because that was roughly how long a block lasted before it was gone. The ice box that received those blocks worked on a straightforward principle. The block sat in a compartment at the top of the cabinet, and cold air, being denser than warm air, descended from it through the interior past the food stored below. Warmer air rose back up toward the ice to be cooled again. No mechanical assistance, no moving parts. Just a passive convection loop driven entirely by the temperature difference between the ice and the food compartment. Transition to refrigeration. The system worked, but it had real limits. A warm spring that thinned the winter harvest, a drought that dropped lake levels too low for safe cutting, a rail delay of even a few days. Any of those disruptions moved directly through the supply chain and showed up as shortages on the delivery route. The whole urban food supply ran on ice cut from specific lakes during a specific window of winter weather, and there was no backup. That vulnerability is what pushed the industry toward manufactured ice by the late 1800s. Factory-produced ice, made through mechanical compression of ammonia and other refrigerant gases, could be made in any season, standardized in both purity and block dimensions, and produced much closer to the cities that needed it. Natural ice and factory ice coexisted for decades, with the manufactured product gradually taking market share as the mechanical infrastructure expanded. What factory ice removed was the dependency on a particular season and a particular geography. The electric refrigerator followed in the 1920s and 1930s, and it didn't arrive as a sudden invention so much as a final consolidation. The cold-making process, which had been spread across frozen lakes, ice houses, delivery wagons, and wooden cabinets for a century, was compressed into a single sealed unit sitting in the kitchen. The mechanism moved indoors. Everything else about the function stayed the same. But the word didn't change. Americans went on calling the appliance an icebox long after no ice was involved, because the object had been so thoroughly woven into daily domestic life that its name had become the name for the category itself. That's not nostalgia. It's a record of how completely this industry had organized the way cities ate and stored food. The compressor replaced the lake. The insulated cabinet replaced the ice house. The thermostat replaced the delivery schedule. None of that was a sudden breakthrough. It was the same problem being handed from one generation of tools to the next. If you value understanding how the machines of the past shaped the world we move through today, this channel documents exactly that history. The ice industry is gone, but its architecture is still moving down every highway.